The attack on Darwin on 19 February 1942 stands as one of the most consequential and transformative moments in Australian history, a day when the illusion of geographic isolation vanished in a storm of fire, destruction, and unprecedented fear, reshaping the nation's identity, wartime strategy, and sense of vulnerability forever. Before that morning, many Australians believed the vast ocean surrounding the continent acted as a natural shield from the global inferno of World War II. The war felt distant, something fought in Europe, North Africa, or the jungles of Southeast Asia, not on the doorstep of the Australian mainland. Yet as the Japanese military swept rapidly through Asia and the Pacific following the shock of Pearl Harbor, capturing Singapore, advancing through the Dutch East Indies, and moving swiftly toward the north coast of Australia, the illusion of safety grew thinner by the day. Darwin, then a modest, remote outpost with strategic significance far greater than its size, became a vital staging point for Allied operations, a logistical hub crowded with ships, aircraft, troops, and supplies needed to slow Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance. The small tropical settlement suddenly found itself thrust into the center of a massive geopolitical struggle, its population aware of the looming danger, yet unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what was coming. When the Japanese launched their devastating assault, two coordinated air raids involving more than 240 aircraft, the peaceful northern skies exploded into a horrifying spectacle of bombs, smoke, flames, and chaos, marking the largest attack ever mounted on Australian soil and shaking the country's confidence like never before. In less than an hour, Darwin Harbor became an inferno of sinking ships, ruptured fuel tanks, exploding ammunition, and men desperately fighting to survive as bombs rained down around them. Buildings crumbled, communication systems collapsed, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and entire sections of the town were reduced to smoldering ruins. The attack caught many by surprise, resulting in confusion, scattered resistance, and heartbreaking casualties, while survivors emerged from hiding to find their once familiar surroundings turned into landscapes of devastation. For the first time, Australians felt the war in their bones, felt the terror of attack, the weight of uncertainty, and the realization that the conflict was no longer something fought far away, but a brutal reality threatening their homes, families, and future. In the days and weeks following the bombing, the emotional, social, and political aftershocks rippled through every corner of the continent. Rumors spread rapidly, sowing panic and prompting thousands to flee Darwin in what became known as the Darwin Exodus, one of the largest civilian evacuations in Australian history. The government, struggling to maintain morale and prevent widespread fear, attempted to downplay the attack, but the truth could not be hidden. The fall of Singapore only days earlier, combined with the destruction of Darwin, made it clear that Australia faced a genuine threat of invasion and could no longer rely solely on British protection. This realization marked a dramatic turning point in the nation's alliances, pushing Australia closer to the United States as American soldiers, ships, and aircraft began to arrive in increasing numbers, transforming Northern Australia into a critical stronghold in the Pacific War. The attack forced the government to rethink its defense strategies entirely, leading to the strengthening of northern bases, expansion of airfields, improvements in military logistics, and new commitments to coastal surveillance and civil defense. But beyond the strategic shifts, the human impact of the bombing was profound. Survivors grappled with trauma, grief, and the challenge of rebuilding shattered communities. Many carried silent memories of loss and terror for the rest of their lives, memories of friends killed in the harbor, colleagues buried under rubble, and the relentless explosions that shattered the sky. Darwin's reconstruction became a symbol of resilience, as workers, soldiers, and civilians came together to repair the wounded town, restore essential services, and transform the region into a fortress capable of supporting Allied operations across the Pacific. Over time, the attack grew into a national symbol, not merely a military event, but a defining chapter that reshaped Australia's wartime consciousness and its long-term approach to national security. For decades, the story remained partially obscured by censorship, underreporting, and the broader focus on other major battles. But as historians revisited the events and survivors shared their experiences, the significance of the bombing gained renewed recognition. Today, the attack on Darwin stands as a powerful reminder of both the vulnerability and resilience of Australia, a moment when fear collided with courage, and when a young nation confronted the harsh realities of global conflict. It is a story not only of destruction, but of unity, sacrifice, and the determination to rebuild. From the fiery skies over Darwin Harbor to the lasting legacy carried in the hearts of those who witnessed the day Australia changed forever. Australia, in early 1942, was a nation caught between distance and danger, living with the unsettling knowledge that the world was rapidly changing and that the war, once a distant calamity, was now closing in with alarming speed. Only months earlier, Australians had watched the collapse of British strongholds across Asia with disbelief, their confidence shaken by the seemingly unstoppable advance of Japanese forces. For a continent long accustomed to the idea that the oceans were its greatest defense, the illusion of isolation had begun to fracture. Darwin, a frontier town facing the Timor Sea, suddenly found itself transformed from a remote northern outpost into the first and most vulnerable shield of the Australian mainland. The news from the north arrived like repeated blows. The fall of Hong Kong, the sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse, the rapid Japanese advance through Malaya, and then the shock that reverberated across the empire, the fall of Singapore on 15 February 1942. Australia had always looked to Britain for security, but Singapore's collapse made it painfully clear that the empire's power was no longer a guarantee. The loss of what Churchill had once called the Gibraltar of the East sent tremors of fear throughout the Australian government and population. If Singapore could fall, what defense did Darwin, a small and underdeveloped port, truly have? Strategists in Canberra understood that Darwin's position was double-edged. On one hand, it was the northern gateway to the Australian mainland and a crucial link in Allied supply lines. On the other, it was dangerously exposed, poorly defended, lightly populated, and separated from the country's major cities by thousands of kilometers of empty territory. Yet there was no choice but to use it. The war had unfolded so quickly that the Allies needed every operational airfield and deepwater harbor available. Darwin became a vital staging point for American, Australian, and Dutch forces retreating from the Dutch East Indies, and almost overnight, the quiet town transformed into a congested military hub. The arrival of American troops in January and February added a new urgency to the town's atmosphere. Their presence was a sign of both hope and desperation. Soldiers disembarked with equipment, crates, and supplies, filling the streets, docks, and barracks that strained beyond capacity. Camps spilled out across the outskirts of town, trucks and jeeps rumbled across dusty roads, and the once sleepy skies above Darwin buzzed with aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Forces, the United States Army Air Forces, and Dutch squadrons fleeing southward. Darwin was no longer a distant outpost, it was a war zone waiting for the enemy to arrive. For the civilians who called Darwin home, the changes were overwhelming. Streets once dominated by fishermen, laborers, and merchants now echoed with military orders and the clatter of machinery. Rumors circulated daily. Stories of Japanese fleets on the horizon, of spies lurking in the shadows, of plans for evacuation that might never come. Air raid shelters were dug, trenches carved into school grounds, and blackout procedures practiced under the nervous eyes of wardens. Yet despite the mounting tension, many locals clung stubbornly to routine, determined to preserve some semblance of normalcy, even as the threat drew closer. The Australian government, for its part, struggled to balance secrecy, morale, and preparation. Intelligence reports made it increasingly clear that Japan was gathering its forces for a major strike across the region, and Darwin, crowded with ships, aircraft, fuel stores, and ammunition, was a tempting target. But officials hesitated to incite panic. Public statements emphasized precaution rather than imminent danger, and many civilians were left unaware of just how exposed Darwin had become. Behind closed doors, however, military commanders issued urgent warnings. The enemy was close, and the time to strike was near. In the final days before the attack, Darwin's harbor was a picture of organized chaos. Transports loaded and unloaded supplies at a frantic pace, warships refueled, and merchant vessels awaited orders that might never come. The American destroyer USS Peary, the Australian corvette HMS Deloraine, and numerous other ships crowded the waters, their crews uneasy and sleep-deprived. Pilots and ground crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft serviceable, aware that at any moment they could be called into the air to face an enemy they had not yet seen. Every sound, a distant engine, a dropped tool, a gust of wind, seemed charged with foreboding. Darwin's people went to sleep on the night of 18 February with a sense of dread they could not fully articulate. The tropical heat hung heavy in the air, carrying the smells of sweat, fuel, and the sea. Soldiers lay in their cots staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of generators and the distant crash of waves. Civilians locked their doors while glancing anxiously at the sky. Everyone sensed that the moment of decision was near. They just did not know how close it truly was. The morning of 19th February 1942 began with a deceptive calm, the kind of warm, sunlit quiet that gave no indication of the devastation that would soon descend upon Darwin. For the men stationed at the harbor, the workers unloading cargo, and the civilians moving through the town's dusty streets, it was a morning like any other, busy, hot, and uneasy, yet not unlike the countless others they had endured since the war crept closer to Australia's shores. But hundreds of kilometers to the north, an armada of Japanese aircraft was already slicing through the sky, engines roaring, their formation tight and deadly, carrying with them the power that had shattered Pearl Harbor just weeks before. At 8:45 a.m., observers at Bathurst Island spotted the approaching formation, wave after wave of aircraft moving like a dark streak across the horizon. Father John McGraw, a priest manning the radio, tried desperately to relay a warning to Darwin. His message made it through, but it was misunderstood, dismissed by some as a false alarm, or interpreted as a sighting of friendly aircraft. The radar operators at the newly installed station near Darwin also detected the incoming force shortly before it struck, but radar was in its infancy, and the warning came too late to mobilize a meaningful response. By the time the town fully understood what was happening, the enemy was already upon them. At 9:58 a.m., the sky above Darwin thundered with the unmistakable growl of dozens of aircraft engines. Looking up, soldiers and civilians saw the first wave of Japanese bombers, high-altitude Mitsubishi G3M Nell and Mitsubishi G4M Betty aircraft, approaching in precise, disciplined formation. Beneath them, escorting Zero fighters glinted in the sunlight, ready to tear apart any defense mounted against them. For many on the ground, the sight felt unreal, as if the war had suddenly materialized above their heads without warning. But disbelief gave way to terror as the first bombs fell. The initial blasts tore through the harbor with devastating force. Massive columns of water and fire erupted as bombs struck ships anchored in the bay. The USS Peary, already on high alert after days of tension, attempted to maneuver and fire back, but it soon found itself the target of relentless assaults. Explosions rocked its decks, sending plumes of smoke and metal into the air. Nearby, the merchant ship Neptuna, loaded with explosives, took a direct hit, igniting a chain reaction that would soon engulf the vessel in a catastrophic firestorm. The roar of destruction swept across the harbor, drowning out the shouts of orders, the cries of wounded men, and the piercing wail of sirens. Sailors scrambled to their stations, dock workers fled in every direction, and soldiers clung to weapons that felt futile against the storm above. The Japanese bombers moved with chilling precision, releasing their payloads in carefully timed patterns designed to inflict maximum damage. Fuel tanks along the waterfront ignited, sending fiery clouds into the sky. The docks splintered as bombs tore through wood, steel, and concrete with equal ease. As chaos gripped the harbor, Zero fighters swooped lower, strafing any movement they could find. Trucks, cranes, boats, and even men trying to swim to safety became targets. The air was filled with the metallic scream of bullets tearing through machinery, the thunder of explosions, and the choking smoke that spread like a dark fog across the water. Some sailors threw themselves overboard, diving into oily, burning water in desperate attempts to survive. Others clung to debris as waves of heat rolled over the harbor. In the heart of town, civilians reacted with confusion and panic. Many had never heard the sound of warplanes before and struggled to understand what was happening. Buildings shook violently as bombs fell nearby, windows shattered, and debris rained down. Families rushed to shelters or trenches dug in haste weeks earlier, clutching children and praying for the nightmare to end. Others froze in place, overwhelmed by fear, unable to process the reality that their quiet coastal town was under full-scale attack. The post office, a central fixture of Darwin's civic life, became one of the early casualties. A direct hit collapsed the building, trapping workers beneath rubble and igniting fires that consumed the structure. Rescue efforts were hampered by the ongoing bombardment, and the screams of those trapped inside echoed through the smoke-filled air. For many in Darwin, the destruction of the post office was the moment they realized the scale of the attack. This was not a warning raid, nor a punitive strike. It was an attempt to annihilate the town's infrastructure and cripple Australia's northern defenses. Meanwhile, the military command struggled to coordinate a response. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but with limited accuracy and slow communication, their efforts were scattered and often ineffective. Some guns jammed under rapid firing. Others lacked the proper altitude range to hit the high-flying bombers. The few Allied aircraft on the ground attempted to take off, but many were destroyed before they could reach the runway. Those that did make it into the air found themselves outnumbered and outmatched by the Japanese fighters. The Japanese bomber crews continued their attack with relentless efficiency, dropping wave after wave of explosives until the harbor was a blazing inferno. Ships burned or sank, buildings collapsed under the pressure of repeated strikes, and the coastline was transformed into a landscape of smoke, ruin, and flame. The defenders of Darwin fought valiantly, but the sheer force and coordination of the Japanese assault overwhelmed them. This was not a skirmish. It was a carefully planned attack designed to mirror the success of earlier Japanese operations across the Pacific. By the time the first wave of bombers turned north to return to their carriers, the devastation was almost unimaginable. The harbor smoldered, choked with wreckage and burning ships. Men struggled to pull survivors from the water, dodging debris and pockets of fire that dotted the surface. Streets were littered with rubble, twisted metal, and injured civilians seeking shelter or aid.
Darwin, in less than an hour, had been transformed from a bustling military hub into a shattered, burning hellscape.
The devastation left by the first wave of Japanese bombers still hung heavily over Darwin when the distant hum of engines began to rise once more. Smoke from burning ships drifted across the harbor in thick, choking clouds, mixing with the dust and debris that covered the town. Sailors, soldiers, and civilians had barely begun to comprehend the scale of the destruction when the sirens once again wailed across the shattered streets. This time, the threat came not from the carriers lurking far out at sea, but from land-based aircraft that had launched from Japanese-occupied Timor. And unlike the first wave, which had focused largely on the harbor, this second assault was aimed at crippling Darwin's air power entirely. At around 11:45 a.m., observers spotted the incoming aircraft, a fast-moving, disciplined formation of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. These aircraft were smaller and more agile than the high-altitude bombers that had struck earlier. Their approach was silent at first, masked by the roar of fires and the chaos still unfolding on the ground. But as they descended, the screaming dive of their attack became unmistakable, a piercing, terrifying sound that seemed to rip through the already traumatized city. Their objective was clear: destroy the airfields at RAF Darwin and nearby civil strips, eliminating any possibility of an Allied counterattack. The Japanese commanders understood that the first wave had paralyzed the harbor, but Darwin's aircraft, if allowed to regroup, could still pose a threat. The second wave, therefore, was a calculated strike designed to ensure that Australia's northern defenses were not merely shaken, but effectively dismantled. RAF Darwin, already struggling from the confusion sparked by the first attack, now found itself the center of the storm. Dozens of aircraft sat exposed on the ground, many still being refueled or repaired after recent missions in the Dutch East Indies. Mechanics and ground crew, exhausted and shaken by the morning's events, scrambled to action stations as the Japanese formation swooped down from the sky. The airbase's anti-aircraft guns attempted to open fire, but their crews were inexperienced, overwhelmed, or still recovering from the earlier bombardment. Some guns had jammed, others lacked ammunition, and communication lines had been severed by explosions. The first dive bombers peeled off one by one, their engines howling as they dropped into steep attacks. Bombs detonated across the runways, sending fiery debris shooting into the air. Aircraft parked along the strip were torn apart in seconds, fighters and bombers alike reduced to burning heaps of metal. One bomb hit a fuel dump, triggering an enormous fireball that rolled across the ground, engulfing buildings and vehicles in an instant. The heat was so intense that men hundreds of meters away were forced to dive for cover or risk being burned alive. Ground crews braved the inferno, running from one aircraft to another in desperate attempts to save what they could. Some tried to push planes away from spreading flames, others attempted to get them airborne despite the danger. But the Zero fighters swooped down mercilessly, strafing the airfield with machine gun fire. Mechanics, drivers, and even medics were forced to throw themselves into trenches or behind sandbags as bullets kicked up dirt all around them. The dive bombers returned again and again, smashing hangars, fuel stores, and maintenance sheds with brutal precision. Several Australian and American pilots tried to take off during the attack, but almost all efforts ended in tragedy. As one RAF P-40 fighter lifted from the runway, it was immediately intercepted by a Zero, its engine shredded by gunfire before it could gain altitude. The plane crashed and exploded in a violent burst of flame, its pilot killed instantly. Another aircraft managed to get airborne only to be chased down and shot out of the sky within minutes. The courage of these pilots was undeniable, but the odds were impossibly stacked against them. Meanwhile, the civilian aerodrome at Perup faced its own nightmare. Japanese aircraft targeted the site with equal ferocity, bombing hangars and strafing the few planes located there. Pilots, many of them civilians who had volunteered to aid in reconnaissance or transport missions, were forced to abandon their aircraft and seek refuge as the bombs rained down. Vehicles burned, fuel tanks detonated, and the once busy runways were reduced to blackened, crater-filled ruins. As the attack intensified, communication between the airfields and Darwin's command center collapsed entirely. With telephone lines cut and radio equipment destroyed, commanders were left to make decisions in isolation, relying on fragmented reports and the sound of explosions to judge the severity of the assault. Medical stations became overwhelmed as wounded personnel poured in: burn victims, shrapnel injuries, gunshot wounds, and men suffering from shock and smoke inhalation. Medics worked tirelessly, dragging the injured into makeshift treatment areas under the constant threat of renewed strafing. The Japanese dive bombers continued their assault in coordinated waves, ensuring that no part of the airfields was left untouched. They targeted workshops, barracks, supply depots, and even the base's water tanks. Their precision was devastating, each attack calculated to further cripple the Air Force's ability to regroup. The destruction mounted by the minute, and the airfields that had once been the lifeline of northern Australia now lay shattered and burning. On the outskirts of the base, civilians watched the spectacle with horror. Some had climbed hills or rooftops to see what was happening, while others crouched in shelters, listening to the relentless explosions. The second wave, in many ways, felt more terrifying than the first. The dive bombers' screaming descent, the whistling of falling bombs, and the relentless strafing created a sensory overload unlike anything Darwin had ever experienced. Children cried in fear, adults prayed silently, and families clung together, uncertain if they would survive the day. By the time the second wave finally turned back toward Timor, the airfields were unrecognizable. Smoke rose in towering columns, merging with the dark haze already hanging over the harbor from the morning attack. Wrecked aircraft littered the ground, some flipped upside down, others twisted into shapes that barely resembled planes at all. Craters marked the runways, making them unusable. Fires burned out of control, fed by ruptured fuel tanks and shattered buildings. The Air Force personnel, though shaken and exhausted, immediately began searching for the wounded, battling fires and assessing what remained of their defenses. The second wave had achieved exactly what the Japanese intended. Darwin's air power was devastated. The town's ability to defend itself had been all but erased. And although the attacks ended shortly after midday, the psychological impact would linger for far longer. Darwin had endured its darkest hours, but the day was far from over. The survivors now faced a new challenge: finding order in the chaos and preparing for the possibility that the enemy might return. When the final echoes of the second wave drifted away and the Japanese aircraft disappeared beyond the northern horizon, Darwin was left in a state that defied comprehension. The once busy town had been transformed into a landscape of shattered buildings, burning wrecks, and thousands of terrified people struggling to make sense of what had happened. The attack had lasted only a few hours, but its impact on the human mind and the human heart was immeasurable. In every direction, smoke rose like dark pillars into the sky, carrying with them the scent of fire, oil, and tragedy. Yet within that misery, acts of bravery and selflessness began to emerge, revealing the resilience of a community pushed to its limits. In the harbor, sailors fought for their lives amidst scenes that resembled the worst images of war. The USS Peary lay burning and sinking, its decks twisted, its guns silent. Survivors clung to floating debris, some wounded, some dazed, and all desperate for rescue. Small boats, many damaged themselves, raced across burning patches of water to pull men from the waves. Sailors risked their lives repeatedly, diving into waters slick with fuel and ash, ignoring the danger of underwater explosions. Some men succumbed to their wounds before help arrived. Others pushed fellow survivors towards rescuers even as they themselves slipped beneath the waves. Shore parties scrambled to organize rescue operations. Ambulances, trucks, and even civilian cars were rushed to the waterfront, converted into makeshift emergency vehicles. The wounded were carried on stretchers, doors ripped from destroyed buildings, or simply by the arms of volunteers who refused to abandon them. The chaos was overwhelming, men screaming for help, fires raging out of control, debris collapsing without warning. Yet individuals acted with remarkable courage. Stories emerged later of sailors who returned again and again to sinking ships to rescue their crewmates, refusing to leave until the rising flames forced them back. In the town center, the devastation was just as severe. Entire blocks had been obliterated, leaving behind piles of rubble that buried both the living and the dead. Rescue teams, composed of soldiers, civilians, police officers, and medical staff, worked frantically to dig through the debris. The post office, which had collapsed during the first wave, became a grim focal point of these efforts. Survivors trapped beneath the rubble cried out, their voices barely audible over the crackle of flames and distant explosions. Volunteers worked with bare hands when tools were unavailable, clawing through concrete and timber as the minutes dragged on. Some people were pulled out alive, many others were not. Medical staff faced impossible conditions. Hospitals were overflowing, supplies were limited, and the wounded kept coming. Doctors and nurses moved from patient to patient with grim determination, performing surgeries in hallways, on floors, or even on blankets spread outside the hospital doors. Some patients had severe burns, others suffered from shrapnel wounds, broken bones, or traumatic injuries caused by collapsing structures. The screams of pain mixed with the muffled sobs of families searching for missing loved ones. Nurses worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some suffered injuries themselves but refused to stop. Civilians played a crucial role in maintaining what little order remained. Families opened their homes to the injured, turning living rooms into triage stations. Store owners handed out food, water, and medical supplies without hesitation. Even those who had lost everything tried to help others, sharing whatever they could find: blankets, clothing, tools, or even comforting words. For many, the sense of community became a lifeline, something they clung to in the midst of overwhelming fear. The attack had shattered the illusion of safety, but it had also revealed a deeper truth. Darwin's people would not abandon each other. Yet not all reactions were heroic. Fear, confusion, and shock led to moments of panic that rippled through the town. Some soldiers and civilians fled inland, unsure whether a ground invasion was imminent. Rumors spread quickly. Stories of paratroopers landing nearby, submarines approaching the harbor, or entire fleets preparing for a second strike. The breakdown in communication only fueled the chaos, as no one could confirm or deny the growing list of fears. Command structures strained under the pressure, and many leaders struggled to maintain discipline among their men. Amid the disorder, remarkable moments of leadership emerged. Officers and enlisted men alike stepped forward to direct rescue efforts, organize defensive positions, and reassure frightened civilians. Some pilots, unable to fly due to destroyed runways, assisted in transport or medical efforts. Mechanics, cooks, clerks, and laborers found themselves performing duties far beyond their training, driven by necessity and courage. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred as everyone worked toward a single goal: survival. Throughout the afternoon, the fires raged on. The sound of exploding fuel tanks echoed across the town, rattling windows and shaking the nerves of survivors. Smoke turned the sky a sickly orange, casting an eerie glow over the ruins. Yet even as the fire spread, teams continued to fight them with buckets, hoses, and whatever tools they could salvage. Many firefighters risked their lives to prevent flames from reaching ammunition stores or fuel depots that, if ignited, would have obliterated the remaining parts of the town. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, Darwin's survivors finally began to grasp the scale of what they had endured. The harbor was choked with wrecks, ships burning, sinking, or lying half submerged. The airfields were destroyed, the town center in ruins, and the population traumatized. Bodies lay where they had fallen, covered with sheets, blankets, or whatever cloth could be found.
Families wandered among the debris, searching desperately for missing relatives. Soldiers stood guard over key locations, unsure whether another attack would come with the falling dusk. But in the face of tragedy, the human spirit endured. Darwin's people demonstrated resilience that few could have imagined before that day. They helped each other, comforted strangers, and continued to work long after their bodies begged them to stop. In the face of tragedy, they found unity. In the face of terror, they found courage. And in the face of destruction, they found the will to rebuild.
When dawn rose on 20 February 1942, Darwin was a city unrecognizable from the one that had existed only a day earlier. The fires still smoldered, the wrecks of ships lay twisted across the harbor, and the air was thick with smoke and the heavy silence of shock. The survivors, exhausted, injured, and traumatized, began the painful process of reckoning with what had happened. The attack on Darwin was not just a military strike, it was an event that cracked open the nation's sense of security, reshaped Australia's wartime strategy, and left deep psychological scars that would linger for generations. In the immediate aftermath, the scale of destruction became painfully clear. The harbor, once bustling with supply ships, naval vessels, and civilian transports, now resembled a graveyard. The USS Perry lay on the seafloor, her masts protruding above the water like broken bones. The Neptuna, still burning, sent columns of oily smoke into the sky. Smaller vessels drifted half-submerged, some still smoldering. Divers were sent into the waters to recover bodies, though many remained trapped inside the wrecks, their final moments sealed beneath twisted steel. Across the town, soldiers and civilians worked side by side to clear debris, assess the damage, and search for the missing. Bodies were recovered from collapsed buildings, pulled from the rubble of the post office, the hospital, and countless shattered homes. Temporary morgues were set up, and identification became a grim task. Families waited anxiously for news, unsure whether their loved ones had survived or been counted among the dead. The final death toll would remain uncertain for decades, with estimates ranging widely, but what mattered most to the people of Darwin was the sheer magnitude of the tragedy. Communication with the rest of Australia was chaotic at best. Early reports sent to the southern cities were vague, confused, and sometimes deliberately softened to avoid mass panic. But despite official understatement, rumors spread rapidly. Talk of enormous casualties, invasion forces, and complete destruction reached every corner of the continent. For many Australians, the attack on Darwin shattered the reassuring belief that distance protected them from the war. The bombing of Darwin proved that the mainland was vulnerable, an unsettling realization that forced the government to confront the inadequacy of its northern defenses. In response, the Australian government initiated sweeping changes. Military forces were rapidly reinforced across the north. New airfields were constructed and defensive positions expanded. Thousands of troops were deployed to protect key strategic locations, while civilian evacuations took place on an unprecedented scale. Women, children, and many non-essential workers were urged or ordered to leave Darwin and surrounding regions. The once thriving town became a wartime base dominated by soldiers, airmen, and naval personnel. Its civilian population shrank dramatically as the government sought to fortify the last line of defense between Australia and the advancing Japanese. The attack also brought about a shift in Australia's alliances. Until that moment, many Australians still viewed Britain as their primary protector, relying on the empire's military might to keep danger at bay. But the fall of Singapore just days earlier, combined with the devastation in Darwin, forced the nation to accept a new reality. Britain was overextended, besieged in Europe, and unable to defend the Pacific. The United States, with its vast industrial and military resources, emerged as Australia's new essential partner. American troops, aircraft, and naval forces began arriving in increasing numbers, transforming Australia into a crucial staging ground for the Allied fightback against Japan. Despite these strategic shifts, the emotional recovery of Darwin survivors was far more complex. Many struggled with the trauma they had endured. Nightmares, anxiety, and grief became common. Some who had witnessed the attack firsthand found it difficult to speak of what they had seen, while others felt guilt for surviving when friends and colleagues had not. Families torn apart by the bombing faced the long and lonely task of rebuilding their lives. The scars left behind were not only physical, but deeply personal, etched into the memories of those who lived through that terrible day. Yet amid the sorrow, Darwin's people demonstrated remarkable resilience. Reconstruction efforts began almost immediately. Workers cleared rubble, repaired buildings, and restored essential services. Within weeks, portions of the harbor were operational again, allowing supply ships to resume their vital missions. New aircraft arrived to replace those destroyed, and military units reorganized to defend the region more effectively. Darwin did not collapse. It endured, rebuilt, and adapted. It became stronger because it had no other choice. The legacy of the attack extended far beyond the borders of the Northern Territory. Across Australia, the bombing became a defining moment in the national consciousness. It marked the first time mainland Australia had been attacked by a foreign power, a harsh wake-up call that altered public perception of the war. Citizens took air raid precautions more seriously, civil defense programs expanded, and the nation embraced a wartime footing unlike anything it had experienced before. The attack also strengthened national unity, as communities rallied behind the war effort, supporting troops and contributing to production, rationing, and volunteer work. For decades after the war, the bombing of Darwin remained a source of both pride and controversy. Many survivors felt their experiences had been minimized, overshadowed by larger events elsewhere. For a long time, official records underreported the casualties and downplayed the destruction, contributing to a sense of neglect among those who had lived through it. But as historians revisited the event and survivors shared their stories, the attack finally gained recognition as a pivotal chapter in Australia's history. Today, the legacy of the bombing lives on not only in the physical remnants preserved in museums and memorials, but also in the collective memory of the nation. Each year, ceremonies commemorate the bravery of those who fought, rescued, rebuilt, and endured. Wreckage still lies on the ocean floor, silent reminders of the chaos that once tore through the harbor. And Darwin itself stands as a symbol of resilience, a modern city rebuilt from the ashes of destruction, shaped by the lessons and sacrifices of that fateful day. The attack on Darwin was more than a military strike. It was a turning point in Australia's identity, a moment when the nation realized that its isolation was not protection, and that its destiny in the global conflict would require unity, courage, and unwavering resolve. The survivors carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives, each one a living testament to the strength that emerges when ordinary people are confronted with extraordinary challenges.